Welcome to U.S. History to 1877. In this course, you will survey the major themes, events, and ideas of American history through Reconstruction.
I'm Jordan O'Connell, History and Government Instructor at Northeast Iowa Community College. This lecture distills a decade of my written notes taken from Alan Brinkley's The Unfinished Nation, The American Yawp, and our course-assigned OpenStax U.S. History textbook. This lecture focuses on freedom from below, family reunification, schools, and labor bargaining. The core question is this: how much freedom can communities build from below when land, credit, courts, and weapons remain in hostile hands? The core competency is to describe the social, political, and economic advancements made and setbacks faced by freedmen in the Jim Crow South. How much freedom can communities build from below when land, credit, courts, and weapons remain in hostile hands? Freedom from below describes the part of Reconstruction that grew through the actions of freed people themselves. Families searched for one another, churches reorganized under Black leadership, schools appeared in cabins and mission rooms, laborers negotiated contracts, and voters entered local politics when federal law opened the door. These acts were not scattered gestures. They formed an institutional response to emancipation in a region where land, tools, courts, and much local authority remained in white hands. Reconstruction from below, therefore, means community building under constrained conditions rather than freedom delivered from above in finished form. This perspective anchors the evidence because legal changes alone cannot explain what people actually gained after slavery. The 13th Amendment ended legal ownership of persons, but it did not reunite children with parents, write a fair labor contract, or create a school board. The 14th and 15th Amendments widened the constitutional horizon, though households and communities still needed ways to use those promises in daily life. Freed people supplied that missing layer through organization, mobility, persistence, and institution building. The record of Chapter 16 shows that advancement and vulnerability moved together. A church could open under Black leadership and still face threats. A school could begin classes and still lack books or stable walls. A laborer could refuse one employer and still confront a county economy controlled by white landowners and merchants, and a man could vote and even hold office while still risking retaliation from armed opponents. The point of freedom from below is not to romanticize hardship. It is to identify the practical forms through which people made freedom real, while the larger political order remained unsettled. The destruction slavery had done to family and labor shaped every later effort. Families had been separated through sale, inheritance division, and wartime displacement. Plantation work had subordinated time, movement, and household life to the demands of masters. Literacy restrictions had made contracts and printed law easier for whites to control. Emancipation removed legal ownership, though it did not redistribute land broadly. Many freed people hoped that wartime confiscation policies or rumors of land grants would provide an economic base, especially after Sherman's Special Field Orders No. 15 along parts of the southern coast. Johnson's restoration policies and the return of much land to pardoned owners largely ended that possibility. Without substantial land redistribution, freed people entered the post-war labor market with household labor and community ties, but without the independent property base that would have made bargaining stronger. Employers wanted cotton production restored, while freed people wanted wages, family stability, reduced gang labor, and greater control over work rhythms and movement. Bureau officers often mediated the resulting contract disputes, and outcomes varied by district. Some agreements provided wages, rations, and housing, others moved toward shares of the crop, and still others reproduced old discipline through vagrancy laws or coercive local enforcement. The alternative paths were visible from the start. A restored plantation order could survive under new legal names if labor remained bound through debt, contract pressure, and local law. Or communities could use mobility, collective action, and federal openings to carve out greater autonomy. Across the South, freed people pursued the second path wherever they could. They left abusive employers, clustered near towns or army posts, sought kin, petitioned for schools, and used churches as early organizing centers. Their choices reveal that freedom was being built as much through relocation, negotiation, and association as through formal legislation. Bureau papers and local testimony make that movement visible in concrete ways. Workers left plantations to bargain from towns near military posts. Families tried to avoid having children bound as apprentices, and laborers pushed for written terms rather than verbal promises subject to a planter's memory. Even when the results were modest, the act of insisting on terms changed the labor relationship. It marked a break from a labor regime in which the enslaved had possessed no recognized bargaining position at all. Labor bargaining formed one major front of this struggle. Freed people frequently resisted the gang system and tried to place household authority at the center of work. They wanted spouses and children living together, Sunday rest observed, and women and children protected from the same level of coerced field discipline that slavery had imposed. Employers often pushed back through wages too low to sustain a family, restrictive contracts, or threats tied to housing and supplies. Bureau officers sometimes sided strongly with laborers, while at other times they pressed for quick settlements because they feared disorder or wanted production restored. The practical lesson is that federal presence had real force, yet it remained uneven and often pulled between justice and economic stabilization. Family reunification and marriage legalization strengthened this bargaining position where they succeeded. A household recognized in law could defend itself somewhat better in disputes over children's labor, inheritance, or residence. Searches for lost relatives moved through churches, printed notices, and bureau offices, and they rebuilt working households that slavery had fragmented. Kinship therefore carried economic force as well as emotional force. A reunited family could pool labor, protect children, and make longer-term decisions about school attendance or seasonal work. Churches widened this process into public life. Independent Black Baptist and Methodist congregations multiplied after the war, and they functioned as far more than worship sites. They hosted schools, political meetings, aid drives, and local dispute resolution. Ministers became spokesmen, fundraisers, and organizers. Women's groups inside congregations raised money, distributed assistance, and kept institutions alive between major events. A church ledger could track dues, expenditures, and burials. The same building could hold a literacy class one night and a political meeting the next. This is why churches belong at the center of Reconstruction from below. Schools had a similarly broad effect. Parents, teachers, ministers, and pupils treated literacy as a civic necessity. Adults attended classes after work, children came when labor seasons allowed, and communities raised money for benches, books, or repairs. Literacy changed the terms of contract reading, scripture study, petitioning, and ballot use. A schoolhouse therefore served as an educational institution and as a declaration that ignorance would no longer be enforced as policy. White opponents understood this clearly, which is why schools so often drew threats or attack. Political participation then connected these institutions to formal governance. Union leagues spread information, organized meetings, and linked local voters to Republican campaigns. Black men registered under Reconstruction rules, voted in constitutional conventions and state elections, and served in offices ranging from justice of the peace to legislator. Voting affected sheriffs, school boards, county commissioners, and state tax policy. Reconstruction from below thus moved from the cabin, school, and church into the courthouse and the state house. The same people who fought for schools and family stability also fought for office and public funds. Well-known figures such as Robert Smalls in South Carolina illustrate one path from slavery to office holding, though thousands of lesser-known local men followed smaller versions of the same route. A freedman serving on a school board as a constable or in a county convention shaped daily governance more directly than the surviving textbooks often admit. The rise of these local office holders explains why white resistance was so ferocious. Reconstruction had changed who spoke for the county and who could claim the law. The 14th Amendment gave national language to many of these claims. Its guarantee of birthright citizenship and equal protection made freed people members of a constitutional order that states could no longer deny openly by race. For communities building freedom from below, this language converted local claims because it transformed household, school, and church demands into claims on national principle. A school petition or labor grievance could now be framed inside a wider constitutional order rather than only inside local goodwill. The tension, however, remained severe. A family could belong to the national citizenry and still lack land, fair credit, or dependable county courts. A laborer could invoke civil rights and still confront an employer who controlled access to housing and supplies. A church could teach and organize while still facing local intimidation. The amendment therefore raised the legal ceiling without solving the material and institutional weaknesses beneath it. Communities had to keep building while also pressing the national government to make its promises more operational. That relationship explains why constitutional change and freedom from below should be taught together. Communities acted because they had to survive and because they recognized openings when they appeared. Federal law then amplified or stabilized some of those actions. When protection later receded, the institutions built from below often became the last structures of endurance left standing. A school founded during Reconstruction, a church governed by black members, or a family made legible in legal records could continue shaping community power long after formal federal supervision weakened. The relationship also explains why setbacks never meant simple disappearance. A voting coalition could be broken while a church remained. A labor contract could stay unequal while a school continued producing readers and teachers. A county office might be lost while family records and kin networks still sustained migration or mutual aid. Reconstruction from below, therefore, should be measured by its durable institutional residues as well as by its immediate political victories. The achievements were substantial. Families reunited when records, travel, and luck allowed it. Marriages gained legal standing. Churches multiplied under black leadership. Schools spread through town and countryside. Black voters entered office and helped write constitutions, allocate resources, and create public school systems. Labor bargaining did not produce equality, though it ended the master's absolute command and gave households room to contest the shape of work. These were real advancements, and they exposed the structure because they show that emancipation created communities capable of collective claims rather than isolated legal subjects. The setbacks were built into the same landscape. Land remained concentrated. Merchants and landlords retained powerful control over credit and employment. Violence threatened teachers, ministers, office holders, and voters, and sheriffs and courts often remained hostile. Federal protection varied by place and by year. Reconstruction from below was strongest where community organization, political opening, and national enforcement overlapped. It weakened where any one of those supports fell away. That vulnerability prepares the transition to the final lecture, where debt systems, paramilitary violence, and political retreat moved to contain or reverse many of the gains communities had made. Examples from state politics help make the stakes concrete. Delegates and legislators emerging from black communities did not speak only about abstract equality. They argued for schools, fairer county administration, militia protection, and public works that would give ordinary households a better chance to survive. Reconstruction from below, therefore, flowed upward into state policy, and its defeat later flowed downward again into the daily life of the same households that had helped create the experiment. The major consequence is a clear measurement of freedom. Freedom after slavery can be seen in contracts altered, households stabilized, churches governed, pupils taught, ballots cast, and offices held. It can also be seen in the danger surrounding those actions. Freed people built institutions before the nation had fully decided how long it would defend them, and that fact gives Reconstruction both its greatest democratic power and its deepest fragility. Another consequence is chronological. Communities often had to begin before protection was secure, because waiting for a perfect settlement would have meant surrendering the field to employers, sheriffs, and hostile politicians. They built first and forced the national government to confront their claims afterward. That sequence explains both the energy of Reconstruction and the tragedy of its retreat. The institutions existed, though the national will to protect them proved thinner than the hopes invested in them. That chronology also helps explain why so many Reconstruction gains survived as local habits even after broader political protection weakened. A school term, a church committee, or a family labor plan established in 1867 or 1868 could continue shaping a community years later, even when county politics turned hostile again. Families, churches, schools, labor bargaining, and local voting made freedom tangible before the nation had decided how long it would defend those gains. The harder judgment is how much community building can withstand when land, credit, weapons, and county power remain tilted the other way. Reconstruction from below proved what freed people could build and how exposed that building remained.
If you're curious how I'm using AI to build these lectures and reshape higher education, visit thelibertytolearn.com. I'll see you in class.